Tony Khan did his press conference on Saturday following Full Gear, and he touched on a number of topics. And I pulled one clip because you and I were discussing this on Saturday about the length of the show, and less so from even the viewer at home, but for the audience, because it definitely impacted those last two matches, and that seemed to be a pretty consistent issue that people had. Was just this was a crowd that had seen a lot, and it did affect the last two
last
matches.
three, in my opinion.
Yeah, you're right. You could include the trios match in there as well. So here's Tony Khan talking about the pay-per-view length and also running Saturdays compared to Sundays.
It'll be interesting going back to Sundays, because I look at Sundays and Saturdays a little bit different from each other. You know, I go to boxing matches and MMA where like the main event's not getting into the ring until like 1 a.m. and the cards are like several hours longer with the prelims, but you know, it's and there's like 37 minutes between fights with video, like, you know, and whereas it's not, the action doesn't pace the same. So I really like it, but at the same time, you know, I like the feedback. So after Dynasty, this past year, when in Philly, I was like, you know, I love the show, but I probably on a Sunday, maybe I wouldn't do that on the East Coast. So I think during football season, I really think it serves us well not to do Sunday pay-per-views. So then Saturday pay-per-views, I will always be a little more flexible than Sunday. But also, I think there was something to the early start time pay-per-views at times too, and that could be interesting too. We ended up putting 3 in a row, which we had never done with early start times, and that ended up being, they were all great shows. So there might be something to that. Our contracted time from the shows has always been close to 4 hours. Like, so if you look, every AEW pay-per-view has gone over 3.5 hours. There's never been an AEW pay-per-view that went under 3.5 hours in the history of the company, because we were contracted to do shows that go about 3:45.
So there you have Tony Khan discussing some of the thought process that goes into these pay-per-views. I don't know if he's ever stated that beforehand, that they're actually contracted to go around 3 hours and 45 minutes, which I don't know. That's I've never heard that before.
Have you heard of that for really any
I've never heard of that for any, like, obviously it's different because, you know, WWE's pretty much out of pay-per-view now. And
but even when they were they contracted to go a certain amount?
I never heard that. I've never heard the idea of like you have to go a certain amount. And, you know, obviously for like UFC or something like that, like I'm sure there's a certain, like, fights go as long as they do. And it's not the case where it's like you get a bunch of finishes. Like sometimes you'll get a bit of a stretch, but those UFC pay-per-views, like if fights are ending, they just keep, like this last pay-per-view 322 a few weeks ago, like you had the pay-per-view started at 10 and it was like 3 finishes in a row, and then we just went to the title fights, and the title fights all ended up going the distance, so it ended up still being a long show. But it's not like they were padding things out, because you'll get that on television, because television you have to fill the 2 hours, and sometimes you'll get quick finishes and then you'll air a lot of packages or go to the desk. But that's not the case on the pay-per-view broadcast.
Has that always been the case for UFC, though, or is it just now due to this new Paramount?
No, I mean, they haven't moved to Paramount yet, but this has always been how they've treated pay-per-views. Like, they don't pad things out. Boxing, you will get that. Boxing, you will, because like they pretty much have it in the contracts with like your main eventers of what time you'll walk to the ring. But I've never heard of it being like a pay-per-view type of stipulation. But regardless, I mean, he's talked about the fact that when they did the Dynasty show, I think he's referring to last year's show, that went really late on a Sunday, of perhaps not wanting to go past midnight on a Sunday night, but not really having that reservation on Saturday nights. And, you know, I think it's very unanimous that these afternoon shows were really well received. And the biggest concern was, well, if you take them out of that time slot, how's that going to affect your buys? UFC tried this like in 2011, they moved the pay-per-view up 1 hour. So they started at 9 Eastern, which is 6 on the West Coast. And it really hurt, number one, their bar business, because 6 o'clock on the West Coast is very early for a UFC pay-per-view, and they did not try it much longer. But AEW, we have no evidence that it impacted their numbers at all. And what we're left with,
there's no bar business for AEW.
Well, we're not worried. Yeah, I mean, for them, it's like overall the pay-per-view number. Did it plummet going to the afternoon? It clearly didn't, and they did it 3 months in a row, and it seems like it was met really well. So I'm very interested next year of like once they plan out their pay-per-view schedule, like you'll get it for the Wembley show, but it's these US shows. Do they experiment with more afternoon events?
So he said a few things here that I wanted to address. He talks about the comparison with boxing and MMA pay-per-views and how those shows they can go as late as 1 a.m. and these crowds, don't get exhausted and people don't necessarily complain. For UFC, correct me if I'm wrong, don't the pay-per-views still start at 10?
Yes.
Pay-per-views proper? Right.
Yeah.
So it's a very different thing, especially when you're talking about boxing, where for the most part, if you're paying for a boxing pay-per-view, you're very unlikely to watch anything but that main event, right? MMA, most people aren't watching the prelims before 10 p.m. Eastern time. Even in a
Jack, and Eric are watching the YouTube prelims.
Even going to the arena, these watch the prelims. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, John. Been a while since I've seen a full UFC show, but these places aren't full by the time you get to what?
Yeah. No, it's a great point. Like you typically get like 3 to 4 early prelims where the arena is probably 80% empty, and then you get the televised prelims where it starts to fill out, and it's like generally it's packed for the pay-per-view proper.
Packed at 10 o'clock, right?
Yes.
Wrestling is entirely different, especially when you're talking about an AEW audience that wants to see every single thing that is advertised. That means you're getting a pretty full arena at 7 o'clock Eastern time. That means the entire arena is sitting through from 7 o'clock till 1 a.m. It's a very different experience. He also talks about the breaks between the action. I feel like it's an exaggeration, but maybe in the case of boxing, it's not. Like something like 37 minutes between the action. Okay, I'll give you that.
I don't think it's not a crazy exaggeration.
Fine.
Like there are
Fine.
some times that you get crazy gaps.
But that is also part of the reason why these crowds are not exhausted by the time you get to the main event. It's because you give breathing room in these shows. Again, Tony does not put breathing room in his pay-per-views, and I think maybe to some people that's like to the benefit of like his booking style. He doesn't put breathing room on his TV shows, but it also amounts to compounded exhaustion by the time you get there. So the fact that he would bring these things up as like somewhat like reasons for why he justifies these shows going the pace they do, going the length they do, I don't know. It feels like he's got a bad read on the reason why these people might be complaining about crowd exhaustion, why you're actually hearing crowd exhaustions on these shows. So I don't really buy that, or at least I don't really buy his perspective on it. Any thoughts?
I'd also add the point that when you're watching an MMA card, there is something to be said for the fact that when that fight begins, like it can literally end at any point. Like, yes, you might have certain stylistic fights that are probably not going to end quickly, but there's always that opportunity. I know 1,000% that Joe and Hangman Page is not going 30 seconds. I know that as I'm watching Statlander and Mercedes going 23 as I have the match listings here, I know I'm in for a lengthy main event afterwards, and it's sort of pacing yourself. And listen, it was a very good card as we talked about Saturday, but you're talking about the last 7 matches of this show. 20 minutes, 22 and a half, 20 and a half, 25, 19, 23, 16 minutes. And that's a very short main event by AEW standards. So, and it's like, I could look at this card the day before and I would have been off on the time somewhat, but I probably could have forecasted how long all of these matches were going to go. And I'd probably look at those times as realistic ones. So, for an arena, the results are the results. Like on Saturday, we did hear a crowd that was, that they sounded tired by the last 2 matches. And it doesn't negate that this was still a show that seemed to be generally well received, but it also wasn't pay-per-view of the year. And maybe if you had a different environment for those last 2 matches, maybe it would have reached that echelon with people. And this one was a little below that.
Yeah. At this point, I think it's perfectly fine that Tony wants to cram as much value into these shows as he wants. Personally speaking, I think he delivered just as much value with a better pace show, focusing more on quality than just quantity. And there's great quality, don't get me wrong, on these shows, but I think it'd be a better experience overall if he just limited things a little bit. But I don't think he's going to change that anytime soon. And I think the only solution to that is to start these shows in the afternoon, which does not hurt his business at all and just keeps these crowds pretty hot throughout the entirety.
Yeah, it's something I think that they should experiment more. And I'm not even saying it from like the perspective of someone like in the Eastern time zone where you are talking later than the West Coast. I think for AEW specifically, I think it's great for like their UK business that these afternoon shows, like there is, to me, like, again, we don't know what the breakdown is of their buys, but I would estimate that is a positive for the UK market, that you're doing earlier shows and they could get them in prime time instead of, in the middle of the night into the early hours of Sunday morning that some people are staying up to. And over time, like what level of audience is being exposed to that? Like that's a really tough ask if you're becoming an AEW fan in Europe and the big show of the month is something that, well, you're either going to have to pull an all-nighter to watch, or the next day it's like, is there still that dying interest to, once you've seen results or the show has ended, are you still interested in spending $50 for a show? November on the Post Wrestling Cafe will include Rewind Away, looking at some of the biggest retirement matches in pro wrestling history with selections from All Japan Pro Wrestling, WWE, and Stardom, among others. Plus, we'll have reviews of TNA Turning Point, UFC 322 from Madison Square Garden, and the Tanahashi Final Homecoming. John and Wai will be taking all of your questions on this month's installment of Ask Away, and John gets together with Brandon from New Jersey for a Season 4 retrospective of 90210. All that and so much more. Join now at postwrestlingcafe.com. $6 gets you in the door.